Welcome to Slavery and Its Legacies, a podcast of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Slavery and Its Legacies interviews visiting scholars, activists, and others about their contributions to the understanding of slavery, past and present, and its ongoing role in the development of the modern world.
Hi, this is Thomas Thurston, and today I'm talking with Holly Lynton. Holly got a BA from Yale University in psychology and then went on to Bard College to get an MFA with a focus on photography. I guess focus is the right word. We're here to talk about a project that she began in earnest back in 2017 and is still kind of developing, called Under the Brush Arbor, and it's about faith, nature, and the legacies of South Carolina Methodist camp meetings, which, you know, we've talked about this a number of times, Holly, and it really is a fascinating project, and the photographs are beautiful and arresting. And for those of you who are out there listening and curious, if you go to the webpage, you can see some of the photographs that we'll be talking about today. So great. It's great to see you, Holly.
It's good to see you. It's been a while.
Yes, it has. I should say we're doing this on February the 26th, 2021. So we're at what I hope is the tail end of the great pandemic of 2020, but we'll see. So this, as I said, is just a real kind of powerful, moving project that you're embarked on. And I'm just curious, what kind of drew you to this project? How did you come across the whole idea in the camp, this camp life?
Well, in the beginning, I was actually making work down in the Low Country that was about the local agriculture, people's relationship to nature. So I was working on a series called Barehanded, and with all of my projects, really, I rely on word of mouth, sort of on the ground research and information to find what I want to photograph. And I had asked Glenn Roberts, who has a grain company, Ansa Mills, you know, what else he thought was in the area. Yes, legendary. Getting me through the pandemic with all his, his rice and grains. And so he knew about the camp meetings, although he had never attended because of the, you know, the food traditions. And he directed me to an architect, a local architect in Charleston, who often taught a course about them. So Reggie Gibson. So I spoke to him and learned more about the structures, and even took a visit to look at them when they were empty, and was immediately blown away by the presence, the way they're situated in the landscape. So from there, I set about a permission-seeking process, and was connected to another architect who is an attendee, which is how I gained permission to go to Indian Field in 2017. So my connection was really initially through the food and the fact that it had a relationship to the harvest. But in honesty, I didn't know, you know, what I didn't really know what a camp meeting would be like. I didn't know necessarily what I would photograph there, or how it would fit into any existing work that I was doing. But I'm immensely curious, and you know, it was an opportunity. So I went in pretty open to my first meeting.
Yeah, and it seems like a really unique gathering. You know, when you described it to me, it's, you know, it's just like nothing I've heard of before, and yet so familiar in a way.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, because I had no frame of reference necessarily, I imagined something akin to what I saw on TV in terms of revivals or evangelical gatherings. And the camp meetings in South Carolina, while they do, that is the origin in the Methodist camp meeting movement, which started during the Second Great Awakening, they they're very much about the food and the fellowship and the gathering, in a way that is different than what one might anticipate, if you're only watching TV. So I think they are unique, and for that reason, I felt that I really had to research the history of them and understand how they had developed, which is what led me to the GLC for the fellowship.
I wonder if you should tell us first about the history, or the history, but what I think also is important is the geography, the kind of way that the space is organized. And maybe in telling the history, you'll get to that. But I find both are really interesting.
Right. And I think they're certainly intertwined. So, I mean, the history is that after the Revolutionary War, at that point in the country, the Methodist really started gaining in popularity. And one of the religious scholars that I read, I mean, many of them really, but one, Catherine Breckes, who is a professor at Harvard, points out that there was a parallel between the concerns of the time of kind of freedom, and there was a rejection of the educated clergy. So there were these itinerant ministers, and many of them came over from England. So Bishop Asbury was one, and he's helpful because he really locates a timestamp for the beginning of some of these camp meetings. And the ones in South Carolina are really thought to be amongst the oldest. So we know that he preached at a meeting in 1800, for example, because he wrote about it in his journal. So he would travel on horseback up and down the entire East Coast preaching. And, many of these preachers did the same, and they were in these open fields or trees, which is where the brush arbor comes from. And the trees created this kind of natural church. So originally people would come from miles around, and they would bring tents or covered wagons and gather for the week. The ministers preached to both the enslaved and the white slaveholders. And then they would disperse and go home. But it was generally in the same spot. So the land, started to be associated with the camp meeting. And then as time went on, they began to build permanent structures around a central tabernacle. So the tabernacle in the beginning might have been a stand. It may have had a bit of a roof shelter, but now they're quite large. And the tents, as they still call them, are wood cabins that are, it's not a perfect circle, but some are slightly different shapes, but I think it's a 12-sided shape that has reference in the Bible. So they encircle. So you're quite enclosed when you're on the inside, and the social gathering area, the dining rooms are often towards the front of the tents, and the kitchens are all towards the back of the tents. Then there's generally a ring road which goes around the outside. And then on the other side of the ring road is where the outhouses are. So they're quite, that's why they're quite striking. Yeah.
The outer circle is profane, and the inner circle is sacred.
Exactly. So, they really, they grew in popularity, certainly. One of the things that I found really interesting in doing my research, initially I thought about trying to research all of the camp meetings in the US and figuring out which ones were still active. And I mean, there are some in North Carolina, there's some in Georgia. I mean, South Carolina isn't the only place where they're still going, but one of the other things that I learned in the history that I had already formulated a bit of a hypothesis about from visiting was that they had a sort of different flavor or characteristic, or even reason for coming into being in different states. So for instance, there's documentation that in Kentucky or Tennessee, there were huge gatherings of 15,000, 20,000 people. Again, Professor Breckes likens them to the rock concerts of the 19th century. They were like the 20th century rock concerts. Whereas I think the South Carolina ones were never quite that large. I mean, Indian Field today is about 100 tents. And then there's another one, Cypress and Cattle Creek are smaller. And then there are 2 African-American meetings that began after the Civil War.
Right.
And they vary in size a little bit also.
So originally was there like a circuit preacher who would go to these camp meetings, or right away was there a local Methodist preacher who would be kind of preside over the religious services?
I mean, I think there was a little bit of both. I mean, I'm still researching, in terms of what they were like in at the origin, in 1800. I mean, there were certainly circuit preachers. Cyprus actually had a church and the church is still there on site, early on. So there was most likely a local minister, but it wasn't, characteristically, and even in Asbury's journal, he'll note that he gave a service at Indian Field on, for example, December 20th, and then on December 21st or 22nd, he was somewhere else. So I think it was typical that they had many different ministers over the week-long period of camp meeting. And that is certainly still a tradition that's upheld today. So today, there may be services given by local ministers, and then there will be other services given by people who travel to come there.
Okay. So it's not the same act every day. That's
No, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes it more interesting. So, of course, these are largely in the slaveholding South, and before emancipation, the enslavers and the enslaved were, in close proximity. How did did that change with emancipation? You say that that after the Civil War, the camp system there does kind of develop a Black religious tradition, but of course the people preparing the meals for the white camps are still those Black freed people who may have been formerly enslaved, working for the people that had enslaved them. Have you in your research, have you kind of, I mean, this in some ways is a dynamic really that's kind of at the heart of your project in a way. Have you found much about the history? How far back have you kind of like delved into that relationship?
So, I mean, the furthest back is still the Bishop's Journal. I mean, that's the only written documentation, that and letters. So I have a handful of letters that were written before and just after the Civil War, and the letters are from a family who lived in the Dorchester County area. And so one is a Civil War soldier who writes about, not being able to come home and not being able to go to camp meeting. They don't really write about that relationship in the letter. So that's why I say the earliest documentation is really in Bishop Asbury's journals, because he does express anti-slavery sentiments. He generally refers to the enslaved as Africans or the poor Africans. He talks about trying to teach literacy, and he speaks a little bit about having services, not necessarily at a camp meeting, but just in his general travels of, having a service inside a house and whether the Africans were allowed to come in, so there is a little bit of an indication there. As far as the camp meetings, what I understand, and I think this is mostly through an oral history that's passed down, and what the current attendees will say is that the enslaved and the slaveholders would sit for the same service, but in separate seating areas. I've heard some mention that if conversions were taking place, again, they would be separated at different time periods. I did find actually another attendee at the Cypress Camp meeting. I have a newspaper article that talks about it's after emancipation, but before, I think many of the African American camp meetings were established, when they allowed African Americans to have a service following the white service. And this particular reporter describes, he describes the singing and what he overhears, in a way that I will only quote, and I won't paraphrase, but yeah, so I'm looking for a lot of firsthand accounts. I mean, there are definitely things that are interesting that are stated in the letters, for example, in terms of visitation. So one letter suggests that this white family may have gone to visit someone that they had in employment at her camp meeting. So there's also mention that, she was given the week off to go to camp meeting, or she wasn't around, so they had to do all the chores. So there's a little bit of that.
Do you know if they would have been listening to free Black ministers or at those meetings?
At which ones? At
the Black camp meetings. Was this after? This was
after emancipation. Yeah. So okay. These letters where they talk about that were post Civil War. I mean, the letters begin just prior to, but then they stretch a span of time. And the one of the mothers, the mother who writes to various children in these letters, mentions camp meetings a few times, and at one point sounds like she really enjoys it, and another point that it's a lot of work. But she does also mention conversions, which is interesting because I think it again confirms the evangelical aspect, which, I mean, today you don't see conversions taking place at camp meeting anymore. And the services are considered non-denominational, even though they're still, they're generally rooted in Methodism or baptism. But yeah, I mean, they're definitely helpful historical documents to me to figure out what is rumor and what is truth. And it sounds like that the tents or places might have been modified. I mean, certainly even post-Civil War, the cooks used to come to camp meeting for the week and sleep there. So there was a bedroom set aside for the cooks, whereas now that doesn't happen anymore. They come to work for the day and go home.
I see. So tell us a little about your first visit, how you kind of aside from the historical research that you'd done, when it was time to visit, how did you go about doing that, and how did you kind of introduce to them that you had this photographic project from this white northern, you're from Massachusetts, I believe, right? You can,
yeah,
how did that
I mean, originally I say a combination of New York and Colorado, because my parents divorced when I was young and I grew up in both places, which I think, has a lot to do with why I feel like I could enter different communities or places where I'm an outsider. I mean, I'm an only child, and I spent my childhood flying back and forth on airplanes, and talking to strangers. And I don't know if it's because I'm a kid or but strangers would always try to get me to choose between New York and Colorado and say which one I thought I liked better. And I just remember thinking that adults were crazy, because how could you choose between two such different environments? And I think about this a lot now, because I think that experience really plays into why I make the work I do. So, I mean, the first meeting I attended before knowing any of the history, I mean, I don't even think I researched, I was really focused on gaining permission and going. I didn't really research how these had originated. And it was going the first time that made me want to research the history, because on the final Sunday, the minister opened with the statement, we are separated not by race, but by racism. And he spoke about the other camp meetings. And what I should say is it's not true that I didn't do any research. I had watched Stan Woodward's documentary about the camp meetings, which does go into the history of how they came about and what they're like a bit, but it didn't really talk about the Methodist kind of philosophy or ideology. And his documentary certainly didn't go into the differences between the different theologies and the different sects of Christianity and what that means. So, after attending that sermon, I really wanted to research the history. But my first trip there, I mean, I was certainly, even though I'm open to talking to anybody, I'm also, acutely aware that I'm, not from the place. I'm an outsider, and as soon as I open my mouth and speak, that's going to be evident. And I also want people to want to be in the photograph. So, early on in my photographic career, when I was a student, I used to wander around the streets of New York City and take pictures without people knowing it, or slyly. And there was a point where that switched and became really uncomfortable for me.
Yeah.
And so I always ask people, for the most part, their permission, unless it's a grand scene and there's lots of people,
Right,
and
right.
people are not identifiable. But if I'm going to be up close, like within a few
Yeah.
feet, then
Yeah.
I asked permission. So that first time I really just wandered around, but it was also figuring out how it all worked, because the camp meeting, I assumed people were going to be hanging out from 7 in the morning till late at night, because there were services throughout the day, but it was so hot, people just dispersed in the middle of the day. So a lot of times camp meeting was kind of, they might come for lunch, but then go home for a period, and then return around 4 or 5. So the activity really picked up in the early evening. But for the most part, I walked around, wandered from 10 to 10, and asked people if I could make pictures. And I certainly approached some of the cooks and asked them if I could photograph as well, which was a relationship that took more time to develop. So I'm glad that I was able to go back year after year, because the first year, while people said yes, I wasn't sure if they really wanted to have their picture taken, or if they were saying yes because their employer introduced me. And
Right.
the following year, I brought them back pictures that I had taken, and I think they liked them. So they were, happy to be in others. And of course, there are people who didn't want their picture to be taken. So that's just part of it. So what I learned was kind of all the different activities and the events, so to speak, that take place during a camp meeting. There's the cooking, there's services, there's meals, there's hanging out and playing. And back in the day, there was something called promenading, which was a lot of spouses were met at camp meetings. So
Sure.
yeah. So when a couple was formed, they would walk around the circle and the tabernacle and holding hands, and that was an
Your
indication.
debut.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what was the name of the which camp were you at? What was your first camp that you visited?
The first camp I went to was Indian Field,
Indian.
and I was there in 2017, 2018, and 2019.
Uh-huh.
And then in sometime during 2018, I think at the end of 2018, after I attended 2 meetings, I was in touch with an editor at Gravy, which is a journal that comes out of the Southern Foodways Alliance,
Yeah.
and University of Mississippi. And she was interested. They usually have a theme for the year. So their theme for, I'm not sure if it's on an academic calendar or an annual year, but the theme was going to be labor. So she was interested in commissioning me specifically to photographing the cooking and the labor behind that. So in 2019, that's really what I focused on. And it also gave me an opportunity to speak to the trustees of the other camp meetings that I hadn't been to and ask if I could come photograph. So that year, 2019, I went to 4 camp meetings and was in South Carolina for most of the month of October.
Oh, fantastic. So, and were they, I mean, prior to that, you'd been to the one, which is it's a white congregation in 2019. Did you go to a variety? Did you go to a black congregation camp?
Yeah.
as
I
well?
went to two African American camp meetings and two white camp meetings that
Oh,
year.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and so tell me more. How, I mean, as you start to, so especially with the Indian Fields, people came to know you. I mean, you were back multiple times. You were bringing gifts, photographs, and and did you notice, were people more at ease and casual? And did you find that you just, the photography was, um, I mean, how do, I mean, you know, thinking of a project that's going over so many years, how did the work you're doing, the photography, did you feel like it is changing, it's getting more intimate, or that that the things, you know, was there a kind of strategy to what you started at the beginning of this project, kind of being the object of you know, your camera, as to later on when you got more engaged with more, the people knew you and you knew them? It must have kind of had an effect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in the beginning I was probably attached to the way I had been working previously. So with the Barehanded project, I thought, you know, each situation I went into, I would create kind of a singular image. I mean, in some cases, you know, I would come away with a few images that I really liked and would have a hard time editing them down. But I was really very much thinking in terms of this, you know, a future exhibition. You know, being able to create 15, maybe 20, you know, amazing images that all related to each other, but were also standalone. And my work had really focused on movement and gesture and action. So at first, camp meeting was a little difficult because there's a lot of inactivity, or the activity is more quiet. You know, it's more contained. But to answer the first part of your question, I mean, definitely, I think the pictures are becoming more and more intimate, which I think is making them better. And I am, you know, even the smaller camp meetings, there's 47, 50 tents, and then you have to multiply that. Each tent might, you know, in a given dinner at night might have, you know, 12 to 20 people. So, you know, there's still a lot of people. So there's a choice of trying to kind of get permission or photograph many people, or focus on a few families and really get to know them, so that in the pictures, and you know, this is the route I've kind of taken, you know, you'll see the same person appear again and again, and but they're made over subsequent years. And I think that that's also helpful, because in exploring the relationship, particularly at the white attended camp meetings where they are hiring cooks, you know, to explore that relationship in a way that shows all the complexity and the nuance. I mean, it does take time. And I'm a photographer who loves light and, you know, dramatic lighting, and there are only certain times of day when that happens. So there are times where, you know, I want to be in the back in the kitchens because of the light, but then I also want to be, you know, see what the teenagers are doing underneath the tabernacle. So, I mean, I think a strategy for myself going forward in future years is, you know, on a given day, is to choose a scene, so to speak, and now just kind of be there and wait for something to happen, or, you know, allow the activity to develop. But I think there are also, I've let go of thinking about it as an exhibition, and or what the outcome is going to be. I mean, it may make more sense as a book with the archival material and some of the historical photographs that I've been able to find at the local archives. But I do like the idea of really going in depth in these various parts of the camp meeting. So the kitchens and the cooking, you know, what happens under the tabernacle space. I haven't photographed services too much yet, although at each one they've encouraged me to do so. Somehow it still just feels really weird to me. and and yeah, I mean, at St. Paul, which is one of the Black camp meetings, they have these amazing screened porches on the front of their tents. And you know, for me as a photographer, just these windows that they create, I mean, they're just really dynamic spaces. So you know, there's a lot to photograph. Each camp meeting has its own store, and they're all slightly different, and the kids go there. At the Black camp meetings, they show sugarcane and You know, there's definitely a lot of candy. So, but yeah.
You know, for the listeners, of course, this is a very visual podcast that we're doing, but we have a few of the photographs that Holly is going to talk about, and so if you go to the website, you can follow along with us, and you know, let's talk about a few of these, just to really kind of give a sense of the work that you're doing. The first one I have lined up is a view from inside the or on the side of the tabernacle, looking at some of the seats. So you say a little about it, and you can see the tents, as you can see that. And again, remember, these are not tents; these are substantial structures. The tents in the background. Could you say something about the photograph?
Yeah, so this image I made my first year at Indian Field, and you know, this is at the end of the afternoon, probably around 5 o'clock. There's a children's service, and then there's the adult service is at night after dinner. So the light, you know, is really just streaming in across the benches, which is beautiful, and the teenagers just you know, kind of congregate under there, and I like that, you know, the teenage boy in the background is kind of bent over, you know, in a somewhat of a praying gesture, although he's not. I think it gives a good sense of the space and the light,
Yeah,
and then
beautiful.
all the straw on the ground that they bring in to cover the dirt floors when camp meeting's in session.
And aside from the teenagers kind of in the midground, you can see the other people are way in the background, kind of sitting in front of their tents, I assume eating or just taking in, you know, the evening air.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think a picture like this is important because, I mean, with all my work, you know, I become so familiar with the location or what I'm photographing that I forget, you know, that someone's going to come to these pictures without that knowledge. So, you know, I made a number of distant pictures or pictures that show the structure and the space. That first year, which I think will be really vital and important to the series, to juxtapose with the more intimate pictures.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I've seen this photograph before, but seeing seeing it now, and the tents in the background, and knowing that they encircle the entire tabernacle, and the tabernacle itself is a huge structure. I mean, it just gives you a sense of the space that that this camp is occupying. The next one, which we'll talk a little about, what
This
is
the
number
foil.
the
Yeah.
foil, yeah.
The foil pyramid, as I call it.
The foil
Yeah,
pyramid. Which,
I'm not
by the
sure.
way, you actually don't title it. Do you title your work? You don't, do you?
Yeah, well, I do. So for barehanded, I titled it by generally who was in the photograph and the location. So you know, for example, I have a picture of someone surrounded by mayflies, and it's quite simply like Stephen Mayflies, Oklahoma. So I haven't. I mean, these I will definitely title which camp meeting they're at, because I think that's important. Maybe I'll again use first names, but it's going to be tricky. And I've kind of put off that. I really don't enjoy titling, so I give
Okay.
them my own anecdotal name so I can refer to them. But yeah, so I've taken to calling it foil pyramid. But which, yeah, if you go and look at the picture, you will see.
Right. The thing speaks for itself.
Yeah.
But it is a beautiful photograph, and again, just geographically, this is the kitchen, so it's on the outside of the circle of camps, and you can see, as you were describing, the road in the background and a car. So this is really on the outskirts of the camp, or
Yeah. So Indian Field is unique in the sense that the kitchens are all open. The other camp meetings, the kitchens are enclosed. So, there is an external wall, and then the kitchen is built off of that. So you can look through many tents, as far as like before the curve of the circle, cuts off your vision, but you might be able to see through into the kitchens of 3 or 4 tents. So this is breakfast being made, and she's cooking bacon. And I just loved, the shape of the tinfoil, and the kitchens are quite, busy. There's a lot of objects. So for me as a photographer, it can be a challenge just because it's, hard to compose. But I love the shadow of light that falls on her, and, she kind of becomes this angelic figure, and there's this chiaroscuro lighting. So it's this sort of beautiful, quiet moment, and the delicacy of her gesture on the bacon. I mean, I just think, yeah, her body, her gesture, there's such grace in it.
all right. I mean, again, I can see you're kind of as with your earlier project, the focus on labor. And from there, let's see. Let us look at photograph 20, which is a bit more interactive. Is this which is this at the same camp?
Yeah, this is also at Indian Field, and this is on Sunday, is the only time everyone gets dressed up for services, and pretty much everyone attends, and they bring chairs out onto the lawn, and people fill the tabernacle and then the whole space. So it's generally at the end of the week of cooking. The people working are winding down, sometimes resting, because pretty much everything is cooked. They're going to have one final meal, a lunchtime meal after services, and then many families now just start packing up immediately after they eat. So I think it's a moment that also shows this relationship. There's often an interaction that happens, and it's definitely a series of pictures, or a moment that I would like to make more pictures of. It happens relatively quickly, and this is a scenario where I kind of have to choose. I mean, how many places am I going to be able to photograph, how many families in this hour, as people are arriving. But I have pictures from a number of years where you see people entering and passing through this space, and I think it will eventually create a rich body showing all the nuance and the complexity of that relationship between employer and employee.
Right, and say a little more about that relationship. Are the Black employees, the cooks, do they know their employer in the sense that they come back year after year often, or are they from the same community, or are they hired through some, what is the kind of, how, what is that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, it also varies somewhat. However, there are many cooks who've worked for the same families for 25, 30 years. So there definitely are long-term relationships. The woman in this photograph and in the tinfoil pyramid, there are 2 sisters who are doing a lot of cooking for this family, and I think they've now worked for them for 3 years, and didn't grow up attending camp meetings. So many of the cooks also grew up attending camp meetings and go to their own camp meeting, after working at Indian Field. And I met 3 sisters who work at both Indian Field, and then not all of the sisters, but a couple of them work at Cypress. And then, as a family, they are all at St. Paul. So I was able to photograph them both hosting their own families at camp meeting and then working at others. So I did meet one cook who had come down from Pennsylvania, and I think a friend got her the job. So I think if it's not someone that's known, again, it's a very word of mouth
Right.
opportunity. If somebody does retire, then they'll
Right.
probably try to pass it on. But a lot of them are long-term relationships, and
Uh,
I think originally there would have been a tradition of teaching daughters or granddaughters to take over the role. So I did see one granddaughter helping out her grandmother. They weren't interested in being photographed, which
yeah.
I thought it was a beautiful relationship to see them cooking together, but of course had to respect the fact that they didn't want to be in pictures. So yeah. And
Okay.
there are no recipes. It's all, it's
Right.
all
Right.
food that's yeah,
Yeah.
that's been prepared for years
Um,
and years.
and what was I going to ask? Uh, are the camp meetings, are they staggered in any way, or is the are are they kind of set purposefully, kind of a couple of weeks apart, so that someone who may be attending a camp one week is and working in a camp another week, or is
Yeah.
some thought given to that?
Yeah, I mean, so Indian Fields. So there's one camp meeting that I haven't been to that takes place in July, Cattle Creek, and that's the only one that happens in the summer. Um, Originally they weren't at a set time of year, like the ones that Bishop Asbury speaks of did happen in the winter. Like, I mean, I think the first one was in December, but now they're set so that they always date them by their end date. So if Indian Field ends on the first Sunday in October.
Hmm.
So it might, depending on what date that is, it could start in September, and then they do run consecutively. So then St. Paul begins after that and runs for a week, and then there's a week break, I believe, and then Shady Grove and Cypress actually run concurrently
Hmm.
the same week. And Shady Grove is quite large. It's about 100 or more actually tents, and then Cypress is smaller. I think it's about it's under 50 tents. And that was where, when I went to Indian Field, pretty much every family still is hiring cooks to cook for the week. Whereas Cypress, some families aren't cooking at all, and they're actually bringing in food. Some families are cooking for themselves, and some do still hire cooks for the week. So, I'm definitely, there is change that is happening in these traditions, and um, but they are staggered, I think, with the
Right.
idea that people could attend one and work at another.
I mean, you have been going to the one camp meeting for a number of years now. And well, actually, what was the structure where the people at the Black Camp, were they both cooking for themselves and attending, or did they also have people helping out?
No, I mean, they cook for themselves. I mean,
Mhm.
it's, sometimes, I mean, again, it varies family to family. So one of the photographs I think we're also going to talk about, Ruth, she and her sister pretty much do all of the cooking for their family and for the friends that they've invited on different nights. Some of their friends or other family members might bring a dish that's already been prepared off site to contribute. Um, uh, People might bring desserts, although there were a lot more desserts at the white attended camp meetings. And there's different food at the two camp meetings. There's
Oh,
the
really?
same food in the sense
Mhm.
that there's always fried chicken, and a lot of the meat and vegetables are the same. But at the black camp meetings, they prepare a lot of seafood, and so they do different seafood nights. There's frogmore stew, there's crab, there's fish fry, and there's generally no seafood at the white camp meetings. There's also what they call wild night. So I had raccoon at St. Paul, and there's often deer meat and sometimes hog. So there's variation in tradition, but I mean, a lot of the vegetables are the same. So yeah, I mean, if they have people helping out, it's friends and family. It's not an official, a
Right,
paid
right. Yeah,
relationship. And at the other
right.
camp meeting, I mean, they often have other jobs. I mean, some of them are retired. So Ruth, for example, she only cooks at Indian Field for this one family, and they attend every other year because as families get larger, they divide. Sometimes they divide when you can go.
Right, right.
And
There's one tent that for that family, there's no room for another structure. The circle is probably
right,
closed.
right,
And so
right,
I'm sure there's some competition and bargaining for which part of the family, the
right.
extended family is there.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the beautiful photograph of Ruth, uh, kind of lovingly uh, uh, looking over her pots and the lighting and that. Could you say more about the circumstances?
Yeah, so all of those pots have, well, some might be water, but amazing dishes in them. And, she will spend a better part of the day cooking and tending to them and cooking on. You can also see the base of the wood furnace here.
Right.
So, these wood furnaces were designed and built specifically for camp meeting and are quite difficult to cook on. I mean, they get up to 600 degrees. And so, there's a real science to it in the sense of moving around the pots where, you want it hotter and then you want it basically as a warming oven.
Right.
And then they feed the fire with the wood. And so, this is what I love about photography and gesture. I'm not sure if she was about to take a lid off or what the true
Mhm.
action of that moment was, but
Mhm.
I do love how she's just has her hand on the pot because the food is sacred. And at the end of the article I wrote for Gravy, I talk about how no one will leave a camp meeting hungry. And there really is this generosity and this openness and this kindness to strangers that extends, is true at all camp meetings. And
Uh-huh.
I had to learn how to eat small meals many times because every
Yeah,
time I would
right.
go to
You had to,
photograph I would have to eat
you,
something.
you couldn't, you're right. You couldn't insult someone by saying no, thank you.
No, and the food was delicious, and Ruth is an extraordinary cook. And so we hung out quite a bit and talked
Uh-huh.
about her family and how she had learned. And when I sent her down some pictures, she wanted my pumpkin bed recipe. So I'll have to find out if she made it, but yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. So you keep in touch with uh, quite a
Yeah.
few? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I called them. I mean, when the pandemic hit, I was really
right.
concerned because,
Yeah.
it's a rural agricultural area of South Carolina. And, I had no idea how hard it had hit the community. And I think, like everywhere, people knew people who had passed away because of the virus. But I was happy to hear that, most people were doing okay. So,
Right.
I reached out to let them know that because I couldn't come back this year, I was sending them more pictures. And I sent them copies of the article in Gravy. And one couple who were a husband and wife, a pair of cooks at Indian Field. I took a portrait of them together. That was something I offered to do last year, actually, for any family who wanted it. I took, family
Right.
portraits. So I was sending those. And unfortunately, her husband had died of liver cancer. So she called me up to let me know. So, yeah, I mean, I keep in touch.
Mm.
And then with the trustees who, have been kind of my point of contact as well. Um,
Yeah. And so, needless to say, the 2020 camp meetings were canceled. Do you know if was there some? When was the last time camp meetings were canceled?
I think the last time camp meetings were canceled was when there was an outbreak of smallpox. And I would have to get the date, but that gives you
Uh-huh.
an indication of,
Wow.
yeah, how long ago that was. And
Wow.
I believe they were only canceled, I think, um, with, I'll have to double check with Herbert, but I want to say St. Paul may have never been. And I think that the camp meetings were canceled once during the Civil War, and then yeah, like pretty soon after with the smallpox outbreak, and that's it. I mean, they
Okay.
really, it takes a lot. Yeah.
So that kind of leads to, uh, I don't know, maybe my final question, but it's kind of a double barrel question. First, what do you think, what is the future of these camp meetings? And secondly, what is the kind of future of this project that you're doing? How, you know, when does it end? What are you going to pick up? How, how to, you know, give me the two endings.
Sure. Yeah, and I might just mention the one other picture that we had
Yes.
singled out,
Oh,
which is
yes.
just of this like the empty dining space, on move out day where the
Right.
kitchen's been cleared and there's this lone plate. So, it's with a lot of what I photograph, it's hard to know when the endpoint's going to be. When I worked on Barehanded, I photographed in tobacco barns up here where there was a big crop of cigar tobacco leaves
Right.
that were always grown along the Connecticut River Valley, and in fact, right by Hartford Airport, there were a
Yeah.
ton of barns that are now leveled and gone. And
Yeah. There's a
when
preservation movement to save one going on right now, one that in fact Martin Luther King as a I think a young man had worked the summer there.
Oh wow. Yeah, I mean, they're incredible structures, so it's
Yeah.
it's sad from that standpoint, but when I photographed people working in them, I had no idea that a few years later they would be gone. So,
Right.
it's always interesting to me how these traditions and these movements, they seem on the one hand quite stable and secure, but on the other hand,
Yeah.
the youth might lose interest
Right.
and decide not to carry on the tradition. I mean, I think technology and cell phones are having a huge effect on camp meeting and whether
Yeah.
people want to come. So, I will certainly keep trying to photograph as long as they are going. I mean, my projects tend to be 5, 8, 10 years. Because this only happens 1 week a year, there's not a lot of opportunity to make all the pictures I want to make. But I think ultimately, I mean, as I said in the beginning, I think at first I thought about it as my other work in terms of, um, thinking about the wall and the exhibition. And then, more recently, I've been thinking about it as a, maybe a book first, and maybe there will be an exhibition also, or, certainly when I present the photographs as a talk, I usually present some of the historical imagery um, and the history is really important. And there's some amazing archival images that I've unearthed, and some of them are really showing the agricultural history locally. And when I went to St. Paul in 2019, uh, Herbert's brother, they were butchering a wild hog, at their house. So I photographed that. So I'm trying to figure out if I can weave in aspects of St. George and Harlem, the local area and the local agriculture as a part of the project, because the food, was originally and still is, a lot of the vegetables are grown all year and put up for camp meetings. So that is an integral part. So yeah, those are sort of my plans. I mean, people ask
Yeah.
me how I know when a project's done, and usually it just kind of makes itself evident.
Right.
but we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, and it does seem that this kind of this is part of, I guess, the slow photography movement, but it gives you time to get to know your subjects and get to know the history, and I think be kind of engaged with the project in a way that I really can't imagine that most photographers are able to do. uh, and I think that's one of the fantastic things about the program is knowing that, you know, by going back there again and again, you are really kind of becoming a part of this story as well. It's been great talking to you and seeing you over the Zoom, which we're not going to let our listeners actually get any. So we both look marvelous. We look fantastic. Really holding up well. Could you say a little about, you know, as we usually do, some resources that people might be interested in learning more about the history, or, you know, the kind of history of the camp meetings, or the you know, history of you know, similar photographic kind of efforts.
Yeah.
Information.
So one of the books that's, I mean, it's not specifically about camp meetings, but I mentioned Catherine Breckus earlier on in the podcast and in the interview. In her book, Strangers and Pilgrims, Female Preaching in America, does speak about the camp meeting movement, and also I think provides a good framework for how it fit into history. And then, I mean, the focus of the book is really around female preaching and how it arose in America, which I think is also another fascinating topic that's related. Minuet Floyd is an arts educator. Yes.
Yeah.
So she published a book called A Place to Worship, African American Camp Meetings in the Carolinas. And she grew up attending camp meetings and has been, her book also covers camp meetings in North Carolina that are still active today. And I think, you know, she's working on a number of oral histories and you know, different kinds of projects related to the camp meetings. And then lastly, I haven't watched it yet in its entirety, but the new documentary on PBS by Henry Louis Gates Jr., it's called The Black Church, I think is, you know, gives a really good overview of the history of religion and the Black Church. It was interesting to me because it does speak about you know, how Christianity developed during the time of slavery, and speaks about the enslaved practicing in secret.
Right.
It doesn't really touch it, and it talks about the evangelical movement and wanting to convert as many souls as possible. It doesn't really speak about the camp meetings during that time, but speaks about the camp meetings later in the 19th century, which are the Pentecostal meetings, which I think is more of what we think about, you know, if we think about Billy Graham and today.
Right.
So yeah, I think that is really another resource that's just come out that's really fascinating.
Well, it's great seeing you again. It's been wonderful talking to you, and I personally want to thank you for introducing me to the best rice in the world.
Definitely.
Yeah,
I know.
absolutely fantastic. And I'm, you know, I'm looking forward to hearing more as you continue, you know, what I suspect will be quite a few years on this project.
Yeah. I mean, you know, as time goes by, I mean, I wonder if they will happen this October or not, or what that will look like.
I hope they will.
Yeah.
Okay, it's nice talking to you. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Tom.
Slavery and Its Legacies is brought to you by the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, a part of the Whitney and Betty McMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale University. Additional support is provided by the Rabina Foundation, and production support is provided by the Yale Broadcast Center. For more information about the Gilder Lehrman Center, its activities, and this podcast, visit glc.yale.edu.